So in the next tutorial, I'd like to show you a few bits and pieces to sun and shadow transitions and how to render shadow lines and shadow transitions, fading shadow, drop shadows in Photoshop using a much wider arsenal of tools that we used before. So I opened up a large drawing segment in Photoshop where you see a couple of large-scale hieroglyphs with lots of interior details like this face over here, and this is already inked. So I put up a new layer and I'm going to disable the ink layer and just start over showing you a few examples using my original pencil drawing. So obviously what has been done before, this is, sorry, I forgot to mention that this is sunk relief with raised interior details. So what we used to do before all these new tools were available was pretty much setting up a path to these longer transitions, and then moving this path along these anchor points before stroking the path over with the brush tool. So once my path is set, I use the brush and sorry, I have to move to the sun line to give it the proper width, and then move the entire section a little bit inwards to add the sun and shadow transition. So basically this is a cumbersome procedure, especially because a lot of it is really just about adjusting anchor points. So in my opinion, it really has not much to do with the drawing, as a matter of fact. And then of course, once your path is moved, you have to fill in the gaps occurring between the two lines and basically craft your shadow line using the combination of these vector paths and just putting down lines with the brush tool. And of course you have to delete the segments that are overlapped by damage. So this is a way that Chicago House used to propagate as the easiest and best way to create shadow. And of course this is all shadow segment, but if I have the sun line included with this drawing, then you can see the difference between the two. So this is by all means a doable procedure, but let's just delete it for a second and go back to other methods that I'm describing in this article. One way to deal with these transitions is to simply draw the entire segment as if it would be all sunline. And because I'm going to move this layer inwards later on, I'm moving my brush outside of my pencil line, knowing that my drop shadow will be pulled inwards. And then what I can do is simply select the segment that needs to be transitioned into a shadow line, and then I can just copy paste this segment and move it wherever it should be, sort of like this, a little bit downwards, a little bit inwards, and then merge these two layers, and basically I have the shadow line transitioning into sunline just like before, except here I selected a segment and duplicated it. Obviously this can be all auto-generated by the method I described in the article. Again, let's just delete this entire area and start over. So basically, once I have the sunline created, again, going on the outside a little bit, so once I have this outline drawn, and don't forget that you can always adjust, by the way, you can always adjust your line if it's a little bit further out in certain areas. Just by using the warp tool, you can fit it with the perfect curve. And then once you have this area drawn as a single weight outline, you can add a drop shadow. Just basically go to blending options, and by selecting drop shadow, you have a drop shadow added to the line. Now you have to make it black, which in this case is fixed as it's a layer style, but you can also add drop shadow down here in the right side, on the right side underneath the layers menu, and then basically change it, moving the opacity to 100%, adding a distance, changing the angle. The angle should be 135, which is basically the equivalent of a 45-degree drop shadow coming from the upper left corner, sorry. And then you have to move the distance via the slider or adding pixel values to the distance, just like I'm doing right now. Once you have it done, here you go, you created an effect, a drop shadow effect that is basically repeating your sunline in a certain way. Now this is an effect that can be enabled and disabled, and it affects your entire layer. So if you wanna, let's say, delete parts of it, because you see now when I draw a shadow line, it always draws double because it affects every single line that's on the layer. But if you'd like to change this effect into a specific layer, basically you go to this little FX sign right here, right click on it and go to create layer, and it creates a drop shadow layer. So when you draw now, obviously you just draw a single line because it's not an effect anymore. But for the same reason, because now all the shadow is on its separate layer, you can comfortably delete segments of it that are not needed and fill in for the rest, like that. And basically, once you're done, you can select the two layers again, merge them, and then you basically have just one layer with the sun and shadow transition. This can be done for a guide, to provide a guide as well, just by going to the pencil layer. Let me just disable it for 1 second, and then enabling drop shadow like that, and basically having this effect shown on your background as an additional pencil layer offset by a certain angle and a certain pixel number. What it's good for is that it would mark for you where the shadow would go, where you would have to lose it, so you'd be able to use it as a guide. And basically by changing the opacity to a lower number, like let's say 50%, you could clearly distinguish between what's your real pencil line, what you have to follow, and what's your guide that just gives you an idea of where the shadow would go. I like using this very much because although it affects everything, like let's say the damage areas where I don't need this at all, but at the same time, this is really very good for whenever you're oh, I forgot to delete this. Let's just delete it again. Oh, sorry. So this guide is very useful for whenever you need the exact position for your shadow line, and basically helps you creating the shadow just by giving you a guide like that. This is where I'm supposed to lose it, like that. Again, there are new brushes that are very, very useful for drawing sun and shadow. I'm going to show you in a second how it works. So for example, when I use just a sun line for the entire side of the ear, of this ear, but I want to add shadow over here, what I can do is go to the shadow line, to the sun shadow brush, start somewhere where there is a full shadow brush stroke, like here, and then gently lose it towards the top. This line, this shadow line that fades away towards the top, towards the where I'm pulling the brush stroke, is very good and very useful for areas where you have to start with a thick line and have to phase it into a thinner line. So when the shadow, where the shadow is homogeneous, it's not very useful because you kind of lose it towards the end and then you don't know how thick is your shadow line. So here I would use a line that's consistent all the way through. Let's just go back and just do it again. I want to show you how it works. So for shadow line in here in the ear canal, I would probably just use another sun line and carefully adjust the two so it blends in with the rest. But for transitions like here or here, I would definitely use this sun shadow brush because this is very, very useful for transitions especially. Basically, whatever you use and however you deal with sun shadow, what you have to keep in mind is not to overdo it and not to perfect the transitions, because you always have to keep in mind that when you zoom out to a possible print value of certain features, your over perfection might not matter that much, but it would be very time consuming, as everything that's perfected with Chicago house drawings always are.